There are so many news topics to talk about in the past couple of weeks, but unfortunately, I've been incredibly busy preparing my thesis papers and working on a really big project that I've been dying to work on for years. And that project is a $750 gaming PC just to play all the best Japanese games, ranging from Senran Kagura to Nier Automata. Perhaps one of the most expensive video projects that I have ever done, and I cannot wait to finish it with my brother at the end of the month. But while I'm working on that gaming PC project, there's something that I noticed as well. A lot of these Japanese games are console ports. Some are not as good as others. While they are definitely playable using the mouse and keyboard, they do need controllers for the best experience. Even Yakuza 0, for example, starts off the game by saying, "Real Yakuza uses gamepad." Okay, which gamepad, Yakuza 0? I have tons and tons of them here. Now, all of these gamepads are definitely compatible for the PC, but some of these are definitely not for those who are budget-minded. They range from $40 to $80, so I do not recommend these controllers if you have a tight budget. If you're a budget-minded type, you can get yourself an Xbox 360 controller, which is guaranteed to play all modern games, including Japanese titles like Yakuza 0. Just plug this one in and enjoy the game. You can also go for Logitech F310 for about the same price as the Xbox 360 controller. This controller supports Xbox 360 controls out of the box, but the triggers are really damn heavy for some reason. The Xbox 360 controller is only around $15, and you can find it pretty much anywhere. But what if you don't have $15? What if the only budget that you have for a controller is your lunch money? Well, you can get yourself these really damn cheap $5 USB direct input controller. It's not an XInput controller, which means that if you plug this game into your PC without configuring anything, the controls are gonna be super messy, and you'll probably end up wasting your lunch money and hopefully not dying of starvation. But don't you worry, my friends, all hope is not lost, because I play modern video games with these types of controllers for years in my middle school, back when I only have a budget PC, and the games that I can buy are... Actually, I don't buy games back then, I don't have money. But now I do have money and a sustainable income thanks to YouTube and my fellow patrons. Speaking of which, massive thanks to my many new patrons. Anton, the Undead Chronicler, Richard, Matthew, Brandon, What's to Know, Christopher, Andreas, Tangoat, and Cat Couch. So many new patrons, thank you so much. You guys are fantastic. Anyway, let's get back to the controller and let's get back to the original question. Are these cheap $5 direct input controllers worth it for all of you with a very tight budget to play modern but not too demanding PC games? Well, let's find out, shall we? From this video, we're gonna test this controller with different video games and how effective it is on playing those video games. I'm mostly gonna be testing this controller in action games. I can test this controller with a somewhat turn-based game like Valkyria Chronicles, but you don't really need too much action in games like that. The mouse and keyboard should do just fine for those types of games. So I'll be focusing on action-oriented video games, which will require faster and more precise inputs. First, we're gonna test this controller with fighting games because they require the most out of your controller. I have Soul Calibur 6 and Tekken 7 as my fighting games to test for today. Second, we're gonna be testing this controller with third-person shooters, which I think are better suited for the controllers rather than the mouse and keyboard in my opinion. I have Resident Evil 4 Ultimate HD Edition and Sniper Elite 4. Third, we're gonna be testing this controller with a driving video game. I have Forza Horizon 3 and Rocket League, which isn't racing, but still a driving sports game. So let's test those two games with this setup. Fourth, we're gonna test this controller with an open world video game, which is both shooting and driving. The game that is installed on my PC at the moment is Watch Dogs 2. I do have GTA 5, but the updates take way too long, so Watch Dogs 2 is good for this case. And finally, we're gonna be testing this one with beat 'em up and hack and slash games. For that, we have Yakuza 0, Warriors Orochi 4, and Akiba's Trip, because why not? Before we go on even further, I'd like to talk about the controller's API, which is direct input. Direct input is basically a way for the controller to communicate its buttons to the PC. So once you connect the controller to the PC will use direct input to essentially translate the buttons to you press on the controller into a button that you can map on anything really. So if I press button 3 on the controller, which is X for the PlayStation or the A for the Xbox, your PC will read it as button 3. You can test this out for yourself in the game controller window. Now, direct input is no longer supported. Microsoft has moved on to its brand new XInput standard, which is what a lot of modern video games are using, and it's what the Xbox 360 and Xbox One controllers are using. And unfortunately, not a lot of modern games support direct input, and even if they do, they don't support them very well. So we have this cheap cheap $5 gaming controller that still uses direct input when every game released right now are using XInput. Is it possible that we turn all of these direct input mappings into XInput? Well, yes you can. There are 3 methods on doing so. The first one is through Steam, but unfortunately I cannot get this to work in most of the games, so let's just forget that one. The second method is through a software called xOutput, which works only in some games that I've tested. There's a very simple instruction on how to use the xOutput. I will link to the page down below. But for the majority of this video, we're gonna be using a free software called the Xbox 360 CE, a software that will convert all the direct input mappings on your controller into an XInput mapping, which means that you can play about 99% of modern games just fine with this cheap $5 controller. And I say 99% because there are some games, very rare, that just don't work for some reason. Cuphead is unfortunately one of them. Whatever methods I tried, it just refuses to work properly with the Xbox 360 CE or even with direct input. Thankfully, they're a minority on all the games that I play using these types of controllers, and I can vouch that every game, except Forza Horizon, works with the Xbox 360 CE just fine. We'll get to Forza later. The installation for the software is pretty simple, but the configuration is a little bit complicating. Once you get through the configuration part, it's a simple matter of copying the files into the game's directory right next into the game's executable files. First, make sure that the controller is plugged in. Download both the 32-bit and 64-bit versions of the Xbox 360 CE because different games will use different versions. Extract each exe file in a separate folder, which I would call Xbox 360 CE 32 and Xbox 360 CE 64. Now open the 32-bit version and there's a warning that there's no xinput1_3.dll file. Just click create file and let's move on. When the program asks you to find settings for your controller, click cancel. There will be a warning, but you can just ignore it. After that, click the auto button right there, which will automatically map all the buttons on your direct input controller into the XInput configuration. Make sure that the buttons are not mismatched, so press around to see if the buttons are mapped correctly. If there are buttons that are mismatched, you can correct them by click record and press the correct button. Once you test all of the available buttons, you're ready for the next step. The next step is to go to the game settings folder. Click the Xbox 360 CE.exe file in there and make sure you check COM, DI, VidPid, and SA. Then you click all the 32-bit check marks all the way to the bottom so you can get all the XInput files from 9.1 to 1.4. Don't worry, the game will use those that are necessary. Once you do that, synchronize the settings and the program will create all of those files for you. And you're pretty much done with the 32-bit version. Now do the same thing that you did with the 32-bit version to the 64-bit version, except you click the 64-bit version of the exe and check all the 64-bit version of XInput files instead of the 32-bit for obvious reasons. All we need to do right now is to copy all of these files that you created and paste them into the same folder as the game's exe. I assume you already know how to find the game's exe by yourself. But the question is, which version should I copy? How do you figure out if a game is 32-bit or 64-bit? Well, you can check this out by looking at the compatibility mode. For example, Akiba's Trip is a 32-bit game. How do I know this? Well, if you go to the properties of the game's exe file, you might notice that the compatibility mode goes all the way to Windows 95. This means that the software is 32-bit, which means that you use the 32-bit version of Xbox 360 CE on this game. As for the 64-bit softwares like Tekken 7, which by the way, this is not the game's actual exe, it's on Tekken game binaries Win64. If the Windows 64 name isn't a dead giveaway, the compatibility mode for Tekken 7 goes all the way to Windows Vista. Therefore, 64-bit version of Xbox 360 CE. Once you copied all of those files alongside the game's exe, you are pretty much good to go. Let's play some games, shall we? Let's start off with Tekken 7. Now, Tekken 7 does have its own direct input to XInput converter, which means that we don't have to use the Xbox 360 CE software. This is a very rare example in which a game allows direct input to XInput conversion. Please, for the love of God, have this in every game. But I'm gonna use use the Xbox 360 anyway for the sake of this video. After copy and pasting the files into the game, playing the game with the controller is pretty good. It takes a bit of time to get used to with the inputs because it does behave differently to the PS4 controller, which I use as a daily driver, but it's good enough to pull off some sick juggling combos with your favorite mains. Soul Calibur 6, however, did tilt my head a bit. Despite being developed by the same game developer as Tekken, the game doesn't really have a direct input to XInput converter, which is really weird. Throwing in the Xbox 360 CE in there and the game works absolutely fine with this controller and the configuration that I showed earlier. It's responsive and it works absolutely fine. Moving on to third-person shooters, we have Resident Evil 4 Ultimate HD Edition. The controller really shines in this game because I play a lot of Resident Evil 4 on the PS2 and this is a mock PS2 controller. Not only does this controller perform really well, but I'm able to score 5 stars as Leon in the Mercenaries mode even after not playing the game for a while. So this controller works absolutely fine if you want to play Resident Evil 4. Next one is Sniper Elite 4. The game initially went freaking bonkers with the sensitivity raised to unbelievable levels. I tried multiple settings, disabling hooks, enabling the hooks, and it just doesn't really work. That is until I disabled Steam's DirectInput support, and now it works just fine. So in other words, you cannot use both the Xbox 360 CE and Steam's DirectInput support. Otherwise, these problems are going to make your head spin. Forza Horizon 3 is an interesting case. The game uses Microsoft Store as a basis. The Xbox 360 CE just refuses to work with that. After consulting the tutorial that I will link down below, I've managed to make this game work using xOutput. It does require a little bit of tinkering, but hey, it works, so I can't complain. Next one is Rocket League. Slapping in the Xbox 360 CE and Rocket League works absolutely fine. Played a single match with zero issues and the control handles really damn well. If Rocket League is a sports/driving game, Watch Dogs 2 is a driving/shooting game in an open world setting. The driving works well, the shooting works well, not really much to complain about in this department to be perfectly honest. Next up is Yakuza 0. I slapped the Xbox 360 CE in there and the controller works absolutely fine to beat the living crap out of Yakuzas. No issues whatsoever. Warriors Rochi 4 plays really damn well. I'm able to pull off some really sick, overpowered moves and juggle the living hell out of the officers. And finally, Akiba Strip, which works really damn well in ripping off the clothes of the undeads. So after all of those video games tested and after judging the overall performance of this cheap $5 controller, I would conclude that with a little bit of software tinkering and configuration, you can turn this cheap $5 controller into a controller that you can use for a lot of modern titles these days. If you're on a super tight budget and you're willing to do a couple of software configurations, then these cheap $5 controllers are still a decent viable option for you. However, considering that I've been using the controllers throughout my middle to high school years, there are definitely compromises that you're gonna take with these types of generic USB controllers. For one, they're not very durable. I'm on record of buying like 6 or 7 or probably 10 of these throughout my middle to high school years because they're so fragile they can break after like around 6 months at the very least. The software tinkering can be a bit complicating for the normal everyday people who just wants to play video games with a controller. And finally, while this setup works to at least 99% of games, it doesn't work in all of them. So if you want to guarantee that these controllers will work right out of the box, you have to spend an additional $10 to get the Xbox 360 controller or the Logitech F310. So to sum up, I personally think that these $5 gaming controllers still have its place, and that place is as a placeholder for a much better gaming controller later on. If you only have $5 to spare for a gaming controller and you're waiting for your paycheck to come, then this controller isn't bad at all. It does the job pretty well for most video games, but I wouldn't recommend this one if you're aiming for a more serious gaming controller. Buy this controller if you are on a really tight budget and you are desperate to play PC games with a controller with a cheap price and you know a little bit of too about tinkering the softwares and everything. Otherwise, save up your money for the Xbox 360 controller or even the Logitech F310 controller or any other cheap XInput controllers out there.